Hi, we pick up where we left off at the beginning of 1 Samuel 5 on this journey of the ark. And as we begin, you'll note on the left side of the screen, I have up the last verse of our preceding section where Eli's daughter-in-law, dying in childbirth, says, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured," or taken, as we saw last time. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, the final use of the phrase "the ark had been taken" of many in that section. Although, as you see in the final paragraph there, the ark of God continues, because that's where we're going now. So the glory may have departed from Israel, but the glory of God has not departed, because it's simply gone to Philistine territory with the ark, as we'll see, and translated as "the hand is heavy." And there are a number of aspects of this scene that are repetitive. You can see there that I have the word Dagon in red, and it's how many times it is in this scene. And if I scroll down, you can see it's even more times than that as we go through this. And one of our best commentators on the language of the Samora, you see down there in the notes, the repetitive style of this first 5 verses, at least, makes it possible to analyze this prose narrative as if it were poetic, and these highly poetic features would explain why the subject of the Philistines is repeated. That's also true about Dagon, of course, as you can see. And I'm going to suggest it's not just those first 5 verses, but this whole section that has a lot of wordplay and repetition and sing-songy rhythm, as if it's a bunch of kids on the playground making fun of the Philistine god here. So let's look at a few things that set us up for enjoying this wonderful, hilarious political satire here. So we're moving through this longer section here in 1 Samuel 4-7, where the journey of the ark by itself as an alternative to the failed priesthood that we saw die with Eli last time. Although we'll find out way later there's actually a remnant of that priesthood left, but for now readers believe that priesthood is dead and the priestly house of Eli has come to a crashing end. So we're picking this up at the beginning of 5, as you can see there, where the ark is taken into the house of Dagon, and will continue as the ark journeys around Philistine territory until the Philistine priests and diviners devise a plan to make images of the tumors, or hemorrhoids, as we'll see is a better translation of that. So this is picking up these themes, and it also is anticipating the parallel story in 2 Samuel 6, and you can see from that chart how similar they are, including the very specification of the house of Abinadab on the hill, where the ark will wait for David to take hold of it. So we're going to see the ark go through Philistine territory here as if it's Yahweh alone, as one of those choices of leadership, with the priesthood being rejected, but it will be in wait until we get there. And this scene will also involve some distance around Philistine territory, as you can see here. So it starts with Ebenezer there, Helpstone, and move through Aphek, and now we're going to find it here, as you see in 5:1, in Ashdod, and then we'll follow that blue line to Gath and then to Ekron before it goes to the house of the sun, Beth Shemesh, and returns to Israelite territory in Kiriath Jearim in our next session. So let's pick it up here in chapter 5, verse 1. And I hope as I go through this, you can hear the sing-songy character even in English translation, as so many things are repeated. We'll also see some chiasms that help us shape this a little later. When the Philistines captured or took the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and placed it beside Dagon. This is the second house of Dagon, and Dagon is a rare mention in the Hebrew Bible, many times as we've seen in this passage, but previously once mentioned as simply Beth Dagon, a house of Dagon in Joshua, but as sort of a character, it's the house of Dagon in a different place there in Judges 16:23. And so let's look at that verse just for a moment here. So the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God has given Samson our enemy into our hand." Of course, that's not exactly how it turns out. Samson will bring the entire house of Dagon down on his head and all the Philistines' heads as well, but that's not what they're expecting. But certainly the author is trying to connect these two houses of Dagon and the failure of Samuel as a judge, but also that the ark can take care of itself, as we'll see here. One of many connections we've already seen between Samson and Samuel, the person, but also between the story of Samson and what we're seeing here with the Philistines here. So we'll see more of that as we go. So this other house of Dagon in Ashdod, and placed it beside Dagon. It's an unusual word, Yetzgig, here, only 17 times in the Masoretic text, as you can see, and the other use is in that precisely parallel transfer of the ark, and it's used in connection with the ark of Judges as well. So a particular verb for placing something, placing the ark in particular here. So now we have in the house of Dagon the ark and Dagon. next to each other. And now the scene gets really humorous, and we have to look at more at the details to see some of that humor. So when the people of Ashdod rose early, and you notice it's repeated again in verse 4, when they rose early on the next morning. The verb here for rose early, Shechem, contrasts with the falling of Dagon, and that, of course, matches the falling of Eli off his chair that we saw in the last scene. So when the people rose, their God fell. And the there is a, and behold, Vaheni here, as we see a number of times in the RSV, omits those, but it's a strong, and behold, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of Yahweh. How that happens is not narrated, a silent battle during the night between the representation of Dagon and the representation of Yahweh, or at least indirectly. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place, and the verb here, swub, is to return, and you can see in my note below how many times it's found in the next chapter. Just a few times here in this verse, and then in chapter 5, verse 11, but you see 6, 3, 4, 7, 8, 16, 17, 21, and then a couple more times in 7. A third of all the uses in the Hebrew Bible are in 1 Samuel to 2 Kings. And that has to do with return to a place, as we see here, but also symbolically a return from exile, as Polzin has noted in his allegorical reading of this section. Reading these first chapters of 1 Samuel is from a different time period than the narration of Saul's right to be the king and David's right to replace him, but this after exile, looking out at the question of maybe monarchy wasn't a good idea, and we simply worship Yahweh alone, as we hear in Deuteronomy 6 in the Shema. So here, Dagon is returned to his place, but here it happens again. And as Bodner notes, it is as though Dagon is attempting to flee from his own house, yet the torso is pulled back, but the hands remain, because the hand of Yahweh is heavy on the hands of Dagon, which captures some of the wordplay nicely there. So we can look at this in some detail, and there's more than that. So when they rose early the next morning, Dagon had fallen on his face, like Goliath will do, before the ark of the Lord, but literally it's in the face of. So Dagon falls on his face, in Yahweh's face, and the head of Dagon and both his hands, literally his palms here, were laying cut off. And so the hand of Yahweh cuts off the hands of Dagon, lying upon the threshold, which is a strange thing. It's only here in the next verse in the Torah, or in the Deuteronomistic history. It's a few other places for thresholds of royal places or of religious temples. And thresholds have historically been liminal places. The word liminal itself from the Latin for threshold, meaning a place in between one place and another. So here's Dagon, not quite in his house and not quite out of his house. And then we have a strange phrase, which in RSV makes sound easier than it is. It says here, only the trunk of Dagon was left to him, but it's literally only Dagon was left to him. So that leads the question of what does that mean? And the Newer Revised Standard, supply the word trunk. But as my note below says, this is something that was taken up by the rabbinic interpreters in the medieval era, starting with the great commentator Rashi in the 11th century, who interpreted the word dog as meaning fish, and that led a couple centuries later to see his successor, David Kimhi, to interpret as only the form of a fish was left to him. So that leads to these kinds of images you see here of Dagon as a merman, or the fish god. But as scholars have pointed out, that's not a proper rendering of the Hebrew dog, and so there's really no basis for Dagon as a fish god. And in fact, it's more like king of the gods, much more like Baal, or for the Canaanites, or Marduk for the Babylonians as their lead god. The fish thing might be associated with Philistines because they're successors of the Phoenicians, who are obviously a sea people, but it's an etymology that doesn't make sense in Hebrew. So no fish god here. But instead, we have the narrator give us an explanation for Philistine ritual, which is a strange little thing, but perhaps it's setting up the presence of the priests, as we'll see. So what we hear is, this is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not step on the threshold of Dagon and Ashdod to this day. It's not even clear why that follows, except to maybe honor the place where Dagon was lying, but why you'd want to honor the place where he's lying with his hands and his head, fall on his face with his head and hands off, it's not clear to me, but it's obviously meant to be a satire on the Philistines here. And so we hear the hand of Yahweh was heavy upon the people of Ashdod, and the word for heavy here from kabod, as we've seen earlier, is the same word for glory. So as Eli's daughter-in-law said the glory had departed. Now here it is, the glory on the people of Ashdod as this weight. And he terrified and struck them with tumors. And we have to look closely at this because this is something where translators, ancient and modern, want to soften the humor that's at issue there. So as you can see, the Hebrew down below, Ba'apalim Badahorim, literally means hills or mounds of the bottom, like buttocks. And so it's hemorrhoids. And although the note below from Samora notes that later commentators use what's called kire, you see that they're Qere, as little internal commentaries to put the word tehorim and a straightforward word for tumors. And although Samora says this is not a euphemism but a clarification, I think it can be read either way, that's perhaps somebody a little embarrassed by the idea that God can bother to give hemorrhoids to the Philistines. And of course, what it's literally saying to us is that Yahweh is a pain in the ass to the Philistines. Whether that phrase would have had the resonance it does for us, I don't know, but certainly the idea of giving the enemy hemorrhoids would have been considered funny. So both in Ashdod and its territory. And this sets up the fact that the following scene, which I'll spread out at least a little bit here so you can see more of it, continues this rhythmic pattern with this chiasm. So you see there's a chiasm that you can see on the screen here from 6 to 12, framed by the hand of Yahweh was heavy and very heavy and struck them with tumors, first in Ashdod and then in Ekron. And then the exact same phrase in the B and the B prime, they sent and gathered the lords of the Philistines, and on the inside at the C part, the ark wreaks havoc on Gath and is then sent to Ekron. So as it rings around the Philistine territory that you can see on the map, the words also ring around the center of the ark, causing this trouble. So he terrified them and struck them with tumors, literally ravaged here from the Hebrew stem, the Hiphel stem, that he ravaged them. It's not so much their fear as the effect it has on them. And so when the inhabitants of Ashdod saw these things, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, literally must not sit with us, in contrast to their God that's fallen over. So we have rising and falling and sitting so far. The ark of the God of Israel must not sit with us, for his hand is heavy on us. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the Philistines echo the narrator here, as if they could hear the narrator speaking. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines. And we note that the Philistines don't have a king. And this is an important setup. I'm sorry. First time we see it here, and then we'll see it again in verse 11. And as you see in my note, you see it in a few other places. The word for lords here, sarne, is probably a Philistine term. It's not the usual term just for a leader, like in Egypt, a sar. So sarne here. But they have a ruling council, not a monarchy. So to the extent that the Israelites are going to want to have a king against the Philistines, they're upping the ante in this arms race of leadership. They could have called for a ruling council of lords of their various tribes, but that's not what they'll end up doing, as we'll see in chapter 8. So the Philistines gather their ruling council. Lord of the Philistines, there are 5 of them, much like the 5 families of the Mafia in New York, as I played out in my King David Godfather class, but that's for another context, isn't it? So they say, what should we do with the ark of Israel, of the God of Israel? And that phrase they've used before, the ark of the God of Israel. The inhabitants of Gath replied, let the ark of God be moved on to us. Why they want it literally returned as if it's been there before. Why they would want it, it's not clear. I guess they're not paying attention to what happened to their neighbors in Ashdod. So when they move the ark of the God of Israel to Gath, of course it does the exact same thing. This time, rather than causing the word terrified here as ravaged, we hear the word panic here. And again, here in verse 11, only one other place is a tumult or confusion. So it's not only causing them pain, it's breaking up their unity. Notice that both times it's referring to the inhabitants of the city, the people of the city emphasis here. The phrase young and old, an unusual phrase, echoing those who surround Lot's house in Sodom. Otherwise, these scenes are not otherwise parallel. And so now they send the ark of the God of Israel to Ekron. And when the ark of God came to Ekron, the people of Ekron are on top of this, and they cried out, why have they brought around the ark of God to kill us and our people? Again, with the sing-song, you see it's rephrased exactly, may not kill us and our people, from verse 10, repeated in 11. So they sent, therefore, and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines, the exact same phrase as verse 6, highlighting the chiasm there, and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel, let it return to its own place, that it might not kill us and our people. I wonder if you could put this to music and make it like a nursery rhyme for kids. So there was a deathly panic through the whole city. This is intensifying what we saw just in the previous verse here. So just as the hand was heavy and became very heavy, now the panic becomes a deathly panic. And so those who did not die were stricken with these hemorrhoids, and the cry of the city went up to heaven, which is the strangest thing we can imagine here, that the Philistines are crying to heaven against Yahweh, who's causing these problems to them. Who they think they're crying to isn't clear. It doesn't say they're crying to heaven, just the cry went up to heaven. A rare occasion of that being described for people who are not Israelites. But it's also echoing plainly the classic Exodus scene 2:23, as you see here. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out of the slavery. Their cry for help rose up to God. And so now that the Philistines are afflicted with the boils of Egypt, as we see from Deuteronomy 28:27 here, the only time that phrase is used elsewhere, that Yahweh will afflict you with the boils of Egypt, with ulcers, scurvy, and itch, of which you cannot be healed. But now the Philistines will try to evoke something that can heal them of these hemorrhoids. And so we move into chapter 6 here, and we'll just look at a few of these verses before we complete it for today. The ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines now, the Bista, not the cities, this wide range of area, as you see on the map there, the broader Philistia, expressing that it's been 7 months that it's in this entire territory. Why the specification of 7 months isn't clear. Then the Philistines call for the priests and the diviners. And as Bodner notes on my note below, when the tumors first break out in chapter 5, the Philistines call upon the politicians, that is to say, the lords of the Philistines. Now in chapter 6, it is at the climax of desperation that the Philistines do not summon the politicians, but rather call out the religious professionals. And we rarely see priests of the Philistines. This is the last time we're going to see priests in the first book of Samuel until chapter 14, as you can see below. And that will also be associated with the ark and Philistines, but those would be Israelite priests, not Philistine priests. So they bring out their priests and diviners, and the word for diviners here it's an exclusively Deuteronomistic historian term, and always used negatively. Exactly what Israel's not supposed to do is call upon diviners. So they call upon these people, the priests and diviners, and ask, what should we do with the ark of Yahweh? And notice they're calling it the ark of Yahweh now and not the ark of the God of Israel. Tell us what we should send with it to its place. And notice that they bring up that idea. They should send something with it. It wasn't the priests or the diviners' idea. It's the Philistines in general who asked them what should be sent. Somehow the idea that Yahweh needs something to make up for what is happening here. And they respond in kind. So they said, if you send away the ark of God to Israel, do not send it away empty, but by all means return. And here we see that phrase again. This is the first time of 8 times in this chapter. Return him a guilt offering, or compensation, asham here. A rare word for that. So some kind of compensation. What it's compensation for isn't clear. What have the Philistines done to deserve all this? I guess it's simply taking the ark and claiming it as their own. Then you will be healed. In other words, you will have what didn't happen to the Egyptians, although it's not clear that we expect the Philistine priests and diviners to know Deuteronomy 28:27. And will not his hand then turn from you? So in other words, if you return that, one good turn deserves another, and maybe God's hand will turn away from you. And so they said, what is the guilt offering that you shall return? And this is where the authors really pull out the great humor here. So the translation says 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, but really what we're talking about is 5 golden hemorrhoids. This is not the 12 days of Christmas here with 5 golden rings. As Samura again helpfully notes, it might not be 5 tumors and 5 mice, but the vav, which is translated here as and, could mean like namely. So 5 golden tumors, which are 5 golden mice. But it's not clear whether there's 5 golden hemorrhoids and 5 golden mice, or 5 hemorrhoids shaped like mice, because what is a hemorrhoid shaped like anyway? Mice is an unusual word. Akbari here, we see it only elsewhere about unclean animals. So that's another little joke on the Philistines, that for their hemorrhoids in their rear end, they make images of unclean animals, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. So that's where we get the 5 of them. For the same plague was upon all of you and upon your lords, not discriminating between classes here. It's affecting all of them together. So they conclude their advice with, you must make images of your tumors and images of your mice that ravage the land, and give glory to the God of Israel. Perhaps he will lighten his hand on you and your gods and your land. And one more wordplay here. Perhaps his hand will be made small on you, since that hand was obviously the one that cut off the palms of Dagon. So that's the prescription offered by the Philistine priests and diviners. And we'll see what happens next time when those golden tumors and golden mice are led by milk cows on a cart to their destination. See you then.